Welcome to The Spiritual Life. I'm Father Jim Martin. On this podcast, we reflect on how people experience God in their prayer and in their daily lives. And I'm joined by my superlative producer, Maggie Van Dorn. Maggie, good to be with you.
It's great to be with you, Jim. And we have quite an interesting guest ahead of us. Coming straight from the New York Times is Ross Douthat.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I've been dying to have him on the podcast, and we had a wonderful conversation.
Ross is a distinguished author and cultural critic. He's an opinion columnist for the New York Times, where he writes on religion, culture, politics, and global affairs. He also hosts a podcast that you were on, Jim, Interesting Times with Ross Douthat, and that is produced by the New York Times Opinion. Ross is raised in New Haven, Connecticut, and graduated from Harvard University, where he studied history and literature. His early career included writing for The Atlantic and contributing to a variety of leading publications. Ross is a practicing Catholic, which shapes his commentary, especially on questions of belief, spirituality, and moral responsibility in an increasingly secular age. Ross is the author of several influential books, including To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, along with two books that we actually speak about on this podcast interview, The Deep Places and Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And Jim, you've known Ross for quite some time now, right?
Yeah, a while. I was trying to think where I first met him. I think I actually critiqued something that he wrote, and then we met over lunch, and then we had a public event that was sponsored by America Media on civility. I can't even remember when this was, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, certainly pre-pandemic. And then, I obviously followed him and read his stuff, read his columns, and I was really interested in the book that he wrote, which we talk about, The Deep Places, about his struggles with Lyme disease. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was on his podcast, Interesting Times. So I'm happy that he's reciprocating, which is great.
Yeah, it's really great to have him on. Before we get to that conversation, we have a question from our audience, and this comes from Luis. The question is, how do I advance with my spiritual life when my church life feels so stagnant? Are they two halves of the same coin?
Well, that's a great question, Luis. They are two halves of the same coin. I think that, part of being a believer is being in a believing community, which is the church. And sometimes the church can feel stagnant. Now, I'm not sure if you're talking about your parish, right? Sometimes parishes can be places where we might feel unwelcome, or perhaps the homilies are not as interesting as we would hope, or if you feel it's the church overall. In either case, I would say that, your spiritual life with God is certainly something that you can develop, even if you're in a parish that you might not like, or if you're struggling with something that's going on in the church. And that's one of the reasons for this podcast, to help people understand spirituality. So what would I suggest? I might suggest, getting a spiritual director. I might suggest going on a retreat. I might suggest reading books on spirituality. We've had a number of authors on here whose books are excellent. I wrote a book called Learning to Pray, which might help. But I guess, I would also say not to worry about that, because I think at different points in our lives, people all feel a little disappointed in parish life or in the life of the church itself. During the sex abuse crisis, for example, obviously people were rightfully upset. But that doesn't mean your spiritual life can't proceed, right? So, in a sense, to distinguish between your relationship with God, right, and your relationship with the church. They are two halves of the same coin, but, really your relationship with God precedes your relationship with the church. And it can still develop even if you're struggling with your parish or with the church overall. So thank you so much, Luis, for that great question, which Ross Douthat will answer as well.
And if you would like to ask Father Jim a question, you can write to us at thespirituallife@americamedia.org. We do read these questions, and we do try to find ones that are especially fitting for the podcast and that some of our guests might be able to help us answer. So keep them coming.
And now a word from our sponsor. Looking for a simple way to deepen your own spiritual life? Give Us This Day is a superb resource that helps Catholics stay rooted in Scripture and in prayer wherever you are, no matter how busy you are. It features reliable and relatable spiritual reflections, essays on the lives of the saints, and of course, prayers to accompany you throughout the day. I'm honored to be an editorial advisor, and I've been writing a monthly essay called Teach Us to Pray from the very beginning, and I'm a user too. I use it every single day. I used it this morning. And here's a great offer right now. Listeners of The Spiritual Life can get 10% off their new print subscription. Just visit giveusthisday.org/spiritual life and join our community of Catholics praying together. Again, that's giveusthisday.org/spiritual life. And now, on to our conversation with Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat, welcome to The Spiritual Life.
Thank you, Father. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm really happy you're joining us. So let's just jump right in. In our conversation a couple of weeks ago on your podcast, Interesting Times, you spoke about your own religious upbringing and your family's spiritual journey. Can you trace for us that journey and how it brought you to where you are today?
Sure. So I have the experience of having essentially been a kind of passenger on other people's religious journey, specifically my parents as a child. So from the time I was about 6 years old until we became Roman Catholic when I was about 17, we covered a lot of ground within American Christianity. So we started out as Episcopalians. We were, in Southern Connecticut, a very Connecticut form of Christianity,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
at least in the past. And then for various reasons, we got pulled into a world of charismatic Christianity and charismatic healing services. And the reason we were pulled into them was that my mother was brought to one of them by a friend with no expectations whatsoever, and ended up having a basically being slain in the spirit is the technical term that Pentecostalists use for this phenomenon, where you basically fall down on the floor of a high school auditorium and have a radical mystical experience for, anywhere from 2 minutes to a couple of hours, depending on how long they'll let you lie there. So my mother was sort of pulled into this, and then we were all pulled into it. And we sort of went through a kind of journey through charismatic Christianity, through different forms of Pentecostalism. My parents were involved briefly in an attempt to start an evangelical church at Yale University, which did not go well. And then, for complicated reasons, we ended up becoming Catholic when I was 17.
Well, I'd like to get to those complicated reasons for you for your family becoming Catholic, but I'm curious, when you were going through all this as a young person, a teenager, I guess, what was your response to all these different traditions?
So I was not, and still am not, but maybe it's less true now. I don't know. I'm not a mystical personality, whatever that means, right? Like, everybody has different kinds of religious experiences, different ways that they relate to the numinous and the transcendent. God has a different plan for everybody. I don't know, but I didn't have the experiences that my parents were having, or that lots and lots of people around them were having. I would go, we went all the way to Toronto at one point. There was a Pentecostalist revival at a vineyard church. This was called the Toronto Blessing. This was in the early 1990s. And you would go into this sort of strip mall church near the Toronto airport, and people would be praying for each other. They would be falling down. People would be roaring like lions. Like, it was a wild revivalist scene. And people would pray for me, and, I don't know, maybe I felt a tingle or something, but the Holy Spirit did not carry me off, right? So I was in a kind of observational role, interestingly, throughout all of these experiences. And, I think you could imagine a world where that turned me into some kind of hardcore skeptic, where I was like, well, if it didn't happen to me, it can't be real. It's got to all be, it's fake, or it's the madness of crowds, or what have you. But I had kind of the opposite experience. I was quite sure, just as an observer, that something very real was happening here, that whatever it was, whatever theological interpretation you gave it, it did not fit neatly into the kind of secular materialist paradigms that I was encountering, elsewhere, right, in my education and school, wherever else, right? And that's still how I feel today. I think that I witnessed real spiritual, supernatural, mystical activity throughout my childhood that for whatever reason, I wasn't invited to participate in. But it gave me a kind of odd, like, it was almost like I was a 13-year-old William James or something. Like, I was like, the varieties of religious experience are all around me. How fascinating, right? But it gave me a lifelong interest in those kind of manifestations of religion and the extent to which a lot of religion's resilience in a supposedly disenchanted age, or, whatever you want to call it, is connected to personal experience, right? Like, I think a lot of people outside religion especially will have the idea that, religion survives because, it fulfills a psychological need, or because people have, a desire to have a kind of political tribe and they give it a religious title. I mean, there's a lot of theories of religion's persistence. And I just had a lot of personal experience of a much more direct reason why religion persists, that you can be a sort of normal secular person and wander into a world where crazy things seem to be happening and where the transcendent seems to be immediately available to a lot of people, even in suburban Connecticut or near the Toronto airport or wherever else.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that a lot of writing, particularly secular journalists, will see it as kind of a crutch, or people are religious in order that this might happen, that they might shore up their difficult lives, rather than, looking at direct experience. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit since you brought it up. Would you say that since that time you would have had more direct religious experiences as an adult, even mystical experiences?
I wouldn't say strong mystical experiences. The more normal thing is like, you have, you find yourself unexpectedly, you're going to have a child, in your mid-40s when you didn't expect it, right? And then you try and figure out what this child should be named. And, you go on a trip to Rome and your wife has a strong reaction to the Caravaggios of St. Matthew. And you're like, all right, well, maybe we should consider the name Matthew. And then a week before the child is born, you are still debating the name, and you walk into your daughter's pre-K and the teacher says, what would be a great name for this baby, Ross? Matthew. I had a dream last night and the baby should be called Matthew. Or I had a dream last night that the baby was named Matthew. And then you're like, all right, I guess we'll name the baby Matthew. And then you look up, what does the name Matthew mean? Oh, it means gift from God. Well, of course it does, right? So like is that a mystical experience? No. Not it. I mean, everything apart from the dream that the pre-K teacher had, right? Everything is in a way happening in the mundane. But it's the kind of thing that, again, it's sort of hard to avoid interpreting as a kind of brushstroke of providence in your own life. But that's also distinct from, and probably you were, going in this direction too. I had a long experience of illness starting in my mid-30s that I wrote a book about. It was an experience of chronic illness, chronic Lyme disease that sort of was a particularly strong kind of redirection of life. And that experience as a whole, again, was not like, there were no moments within it where the heavens opened and, the Virgin descended and, handed me a tilma. But there were plenty of moments inside that experience when, strange coincidental things seemed to happen in ways that felt like guideposts, helping hands, these kind of things. But again, all of it less direct than the, sort of transformative experience of the divine that is like the core of mystical experience. I'm not a mystic in that way, even now.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing that up, because for so many people, they feel sometimes if they hear of these experiences or read stories of the lives of the saints, and they think, if I haven't had that kind of experience, I'm somehow a bad Catholic, or God doesn't love me, or I'm not open to God. But you're right. I think most of these things happen, in the everyday world, right? And it is about noticing, as you were saying, kind of ascribing it to God and really making that leap. Let me back up a little bit. I do want to talk about your book on Lyme disease, but you said that your family, I think you said, ended up as Catholic for complicated reasons. Can you walk us through that a little bit, how your family...
Well, they weren't that complicated, right? We had been Episcopalian, so we had a kind of ecclesiastical experience somewhere in our past, in my mother's upbringing and so on. And I think for my mother especially, and she has written about this some, her name is Patricia Snow. You can read some of her essays for First Things. But for her, it was always very much like, having had a set of mystical experiences, she wanted to find a kind of institutional grounding for those experiences, like a place where, having, become, I mean, she was already Christian, but having become Christian in some fuller sense, she could feel like this was the place where God wanted her to be. So we were always sort of looking for a place to rest. I think for her, there was a kind of bridge in mystical experience between charismatic Christianity and Catholicism, which, in certain ways, obviously, they're very, very far apart on the spectrum of different expressions of Christianity, right? The people having a revival meeting are in a pretty different place than people, going to Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's or something. But there is, I think, some real continuity and overlap between sort of how people write about the direct mystical experience of God in the Catholic mystical tradition and in these sort of forms of charismatic Protestantism. And I think that, plus her own direct experience, was a very important contributor to her eventually deciding to become Catholic. For me, it was more because I wasn't a mystical character. It was in certain ways more conventional, right? It was like, all right, I'm a sort of nerdy teenager and I'm reading C.S. Lewis and I'm reading G.K. Chesterton, and the Catholic Church has a lot of very strong intellectual firepower behind it. It has a lot of history and pedigree and all of these kind of things. And also, right, so I've said that I was very interested in watching mystical experience, but by the time you become a teenager, you also have a certain awkwardness and anxiety about a form of religious practice that focuses so heavily on the kind of personal and the expressive, right? And, you'll meet people, I've met people, I'm sure you have too, lapsed Catholics who will say, the problem with Catholicism was that it was all like rote memorization and, everyone's sitting in the back at Mass and nobody's singing the hymns and so on. And when you're 16 or 17 years old, sometimes that can be really nice, right? It's like, oh, great. I can just, I can go to church and the prayers are there to be memorized, right? And no one is going to come up to me midway through the service, at least at the Catholic churches we attended, there is some variation here, and say, son, could you testify to how the Lord Jesus has changed your heart, right? Like, I was perfectly happy to be given, Our Fathers and Hail Marys to pray instead of being asked for personal testimony. And there also is something, if you are someone who has watched other people have mystical experiences without having had them yourself, there's something attractive and comforting in what the church says about the sacraments, right? And how grace works in the sacraments, the idea that it is operational in a way that, you can count on, even if you aren't hearing flights of angels singing to you at the moment of baptism or when you're in the confessional or anything like that, right? The idea that, yes, as you said, God gives sort of extreme gifts and extreme manifestations to some people, but for lots of people, it's good to be told, look, today you went to confession, your sins are forgiven, it's set, you can count on it, even if you aren't lying on the floor of the church quivering in any kind of supernatural ecstasy afterward.
That's a great insight because I think it, can calm us down to know that we don't have to be mystics, right? And we can rely on the sacraments. And, your point about, you don't have to be a mystic to receive communion. Also, the priest doesn't have to be perfect, to consecrate the Eucharist. What would you say as an adult now keeps you in the Catholic Church other than the promises you made?
I mean, I think that I have never had any real doubt that God was strongly present inside Roman Catholicism. And initially, that certainty was maybe primarily intellectual and a matter of reading history and theology and apologetics. And over time, it's more personal. It's not just sort of the kind of, modest personal experiences that I've had myself. It's also just being embedded in a community and knowing lots and lots of different kinds of Catholics who all have their own story and their own dramas and so on. But in many of them, you encounter stories and personal experiences and all of these kind of things that I think just sort of testify persistently to God's action inside the church.
I really like that connection you drew between the kind of Pentecostal experiences and being slain in the Spirit and the mystical tradition of the Catholic Church. There is, obviously an overlap, and it's obviously the same Spirit. Are there parts of that tradition and parts of the practices of Pentecostal churches and charismatic churches that you miss, by being a Catholic?
I mean, I think what people can miss is this kind of immediacy, right? Of again, that I myself did not experience. So I'm sort of the wrong person to describe this, right? But like there are forms of liturgical Christianity that can just sort of feel rote or arid or empty, right? And I think especially, I don't attend the Latin Mass. I'm not like any kind of full traditionalist, but I think there is a kind of, highly banalized, if that's the right word, form of, post 1960s or 1970s Catholic practice that just, it feels like it's sort of neither fish nor fowl. It's neither the intense liturgical experience of the Orthodox divine liturgy, but nor is it in an immediate encounter with God of the kind that that Pentecostalism seems to offer. I think a lot of people who drift from like suburban American Catholicism into Pentecostalist or charismatic Christianity, it's not about sort of theological principles. It's about the failure of certain kinds of Catholicism to deliver a sense that actually something mystical, something divine is happening here. And when you're in a room with people who are, lying on the floor, or where you're watching a woman who has a healing ministry walk around the room and point to people and they just fall down, right? Like that's immediate. That's powerful. And I think that is a real thing that draws people into those forms of Christianity, the sense that like, you read the New Testament, right? And it's like, you read the Acts of the Apostles, you read about the early church, and there's sort of this immediacy to the presence of the Holy Spirit, where it's like, every day has a kind of Pentecostal element that Christians understandably want. And a version of that, I think, is present in charismatic Christianity. The challenge that it didn't meet for us, right? The test it failed in a way is sort of continuity beyond that initial encounter, right? That sense of kind of direct connection and communion, right? It's like, well, what do you do? What do you do when that is withdrawn? What do you do if you don't experience it all? What do you do if you enter into a dark night of the soul? What do you do if the charismatic figure with the healing gift turns out to be scandal prone, or turns out to be faking some of the healings or anything like that, right? And those are the places where I think the advantages of traditional apostolic Christianity are real and potent, right? Again, the idea that like you aren't just trying to sustain a kind of permanent supernatural high. You're trying to live in the world, which God wants us to do, right? To live in our bodies and the material. And you want to have churches that, are sort of there for the long haul. That tends to be the great advantage of more traditional and institutional forms of Christian faith.
I do want to move on. You had brought it up, and I'm really interested in talking with you, and I think our listeners would be very interested in hearing about your bout with Lyme disease, which you talked about in your book, The Deep Places, which I thought was beautiful. Can you explain the onset of that illness and especially how it affected your spiritual life?
Sure. We lived in Washington, D.C., and my wife and I were both from New England. We had 2 little kids at that point, and we'd always had a kind of ambition to move back to the Northeast and be closer to our families. And I especially had a kind of romantic idea of owning a house in the country with, stone walls and fences and fields. And somewhat recklessly, we actually decided to do that. We bought a house in my wife's hometown in the western part of Connecticut.
It's like Mr. Blandings.
Exactly, from 1790, 3.5 acres, these sort of barns that were sinking into the fields that I was planning to refurbish. And I immediately became horribly, horribly ill. And it took a little while to figure out what it was because the constellation of symptoms was so strange, but it was, pain all over my body, total insomnia, vibrations in my chest, just incredibly bizarre array of symptoms. And then when I figured out that what I had was this illness carried by deer ticks that lots and lots of people in the Northeast get, then it turned out that I was in the fun category of people who have this and don't respond immediately to antibiotic treatment. And so enter this kind of zone, or I did respond in the sense that I stabilized. I went from sleeping 1 hour a night to 4.5 hours a night, right? And I went from feeling like I was disintegrating to just being in, a sort of low level of pain all the time. So there was some stabilization, but then I had to spend years basically in this sort of zone of medical uncertainty where the sort of official medicine doesn't have a theory of what chronic Lyme is, isn't sure it's real. You have to see specialized doctors who are extremely eccentric, and you enter into a world of strange treatments, alternative medicine, all kinds of very, very weird stuff that you would never imagine yourself doing before you have this kind of experience, right? But once you are desperately, desperately sick and feel unable to function as a normal human being in the world, you will try anything. So that was the basic experience. I think that its effect on my spiritual life, I guess, there were a couple of different levels, right? On the one hand, there was the basic sense in which God didn't heal me. I prayed, you prayed desperately for healing. I didn't sort of receive dramatic healing at any point. All of my progress was incremental and driven by sort of weird forms of exploration and experiment. But I did feel like there were sort of signposts and help. And it was like, to the extent that there was a message from God, the message was, I'm afraid you have to go through this. Right. And, I'm still here and I haven't abandoned you, but I'm not just going to deliver you from this in any kind of simple way. This is, for whatever reason, an experience that's, part of what is necessary for your life, for your development, maybe to redirect you. We abandoned the farmhouse and sold it and gave up on the fantasy of the rural life. So it seemed like God was pretty explicitly saying that was a mistake or an idol that I needed to let go of. And then at the basic level, like, you mentioned earlier, the idea that religion sometimes gets portrayed as a crutch, and that's not really where a lot of religious impulses come from. But in the case of extreme suffering and illness, religion is absolutely a crutch. And I don't think there's anything in my experience that would, convince an atheist to believe in God, because it would always be easy for the atheist to say, well, you were sick and you needed to feel like this was all for a reason. You needed to feel like if you sort of went through this and kept on trying to be a husband and a father and held your life together, that there would be a point to it. And that was true. I needed to believe that. And it was tremendously helpful that I went into the illness with an already existing form of faith.
Let me pause a little bit. I know thank you for being so honest. I know a lot of our listeners will wonder, and I think we all go through different periods of suffering in our lives. When you say you came to the understanding that this was something you, in a sense, needed to go through, or that God was asking you to go through, I think a lot of people will say, well, how did you come to that recognition? Was it something in prayer? Was it sort of just seeing it not go away and assuming that this is what God wanted? Like what enabled you to make that sort of come to that conclusion?
Part of it was just the fact that it didn't go away, right? That I did many religious things and asked for help in every way that a person could ask for help. And if you do that and, don't experience some transformative healing, then if God exists, you have to assume, right, that, God answers every prayer. And sometimes the answer is no or not yet. So there's that's sort of the simplest way of putting it. But then beyond that, there was sort of a combination, right, of this sense of like, I would get help. It felt like, again, in the mode of sort of coincidence and serendipity and my paths crossing with someone here and something working out over here, it did feel like I was getting some kind of help. But the help was always like a hand pulling you one step along the path. It was never, the Jeep pulling up and saying, good news,
Right.
we're gonna get to the destination in 5 minutes, right? So when that happens, and I wrote about a few of these things in the book, if people are interested, sort of moments of, moments where it felt like God was not altogether distant from me, but they weren't cures. So if God is with you and sort of helping you in small ways, but the help is mostly just for you to keep going and keep trying to get better. Like I was certainly sure that I wasn't supposed to just suffer, right? That there was something I was supposed to learn about the world, maybe, or about my own capacities, or about the nature of medicine or something. I'm still not sure exactly what it was, but I did learn a number of things just through the process of going to weird doctors and trying weird things and meeting people who were suffering in similar ways and sort of comparing our journeys to one another. And all of that added up to the sense that, like, had God just healed me on day one, then whatever, then it would have been worse for me in some way, right? And that's easier to say because I did eventually get better. It's easier for me to say now by far than it would have been for me to say, 6 years ago when I was in the thick of it. I'm not completely better. I still have residual symptoms and problems, but I am much, much, much better than I was at my worst. And obviously, there are plenty of people who experience suffering who don't get better on that kind of time scale. There are people who experience suffering and die. There are people who experience suffering through people who are close to them, who lose a child, all of these kind of things, right? And those experiences are going to be different. And I don't think, I wouldn't say that, like, the experience I had of feeling like this suffering was being given to me for some reason is necessarily going to be the best way to react to any kind of suffering in your life. But, you have to react to the experiences you have. This was an experience I had, and this was what I felt like God was doing.
Yeah, and I think that step-by-step insight is very helpful because that really is, God gives us the grace to, take that next step. You remind me, I had an operation a couple of years ago that was pretty difficult, and I was talking to a friend of mine who is a Jesuit priest and a doctor about the different things that I had learned. And I said, but I would have liked to have learned it without the operation and all this other stuff. And he said something very funny. He said, well, you wouldn't have learned it. You might not have been open to it. So I'm curious, when you talk about what you learned, even though it's, you're still learning, what would you say you took from that experience?
Well, again, you want to be careful, right? And not claim too much for yourself. I think, the first thing, I mentioned this already, right? Like, I learned something about the difference between one's own plans and what God might have in mind for you. So prior to this experience, this, started in my mid-30s, I had a pretty nice run where the things I wanted and the things that God wanted seemed to be the same, right? It's like, you get married to the beautiful girl you met in college. I got a job at the New York Times at a very young age. That was a dream job. We had a couple of kids, and now we were going to get the house in the Connecticut country that I'd always fantasized about, right? So I think at that point in my mind, yes, in theory, I knew that I could have desires that were not the thing that God wanted for me. But in practice, it just seemed like, if I want something, that probably means God wants it too, right? So this was a pretty stern corrective to that assumption about your life, right? That, if you have some kind of personal ambition or personal dream, you can just assume that, God must want you to fulfill it. Sometimes the answer is no, God does not want you to fulfill it. And in fact, the dream is a mistake, an idol, a folly, a sin, what have you. So that's one level. I think that I write obviously about politics and religion and other issues for a living. And when I look back on the work I did when I was at my sickest, I wrote a lot of very angry columns. And some of them were columns about Donald Trump. I was a never Trump Republican, and I was very angry that Donald Trump was taking over the Republican Party. Those were columns that I imagine you liked. And some of them were about Pope Francis. And I was a conservative Catholic who didn't like some of the things that the Pope was doing, thought they were very dangerous and destructive for the church, and wrote about that. And those were columns that I know for a fact that you did not like, right? And since then, as I gradually got better and got somewhat through the experience, right, I feel like I developed just in both religion and politics, all the areas I write about, I developed a certain kind of detachment from, things that are real and important issues. What happens to the Catholic Church is an incredibly important issue. What happens to the United States under Donald Trump is incredibly important. And obviously, you can go too far in your detachment. But I think that most people who do what I do get very, very close to the issues and sort of can't struggle to separate their own emotional reaction to events from analysis of events. And I think in the course of my illness, I was very angry at first, and then I separated somewhat. And yeah, that comes with problems, but I think there are advantages to that as someone whose vocation it is to write about the world and understand the world. I think detaching a little bit is important.
That's really interesting. So the detachment, I want to make sure I understand you. The detachment came from sort of a sense of humility in front of the illness, or a sense of there are bigger things in life than this kind of
not so much bigger, but just the sense, one, certain forms of suffering are inescapable, right? There isn't a perfect political solution to human suffering. There also isn't a perfect theological solution to human suffering, where it's like, oh, if only you have the perfect pope and the perfect bishops and the perfect church, sin and suffering and problems will disappear. It was probably some of that. It was also probably just a sense of, gratitude. Like, you do get a sense of gratitude when you come back to the ordinary after you've been sort of separated from it, where it's like, when you're really sick, there's just all these basic things like eating a meal, that you lose the ability to enjoy in any way, shape, or form, right? Like, there were long stretches in the illness when I took no enjoyment out of ordinary life. And so if you come back to the ordinary enjoyment of life, it helps, I think, have some perspective on the very real problems that you read about, or in the newspaper, or in my case, write about in the newspaper, right? That there is what's the Auden poem, right? Where Icarus is falling into the sea, right? And he's talking about how the old masters, the painters, would paint sort of ordinary life going on, even while these really dramatic events were happening. And I think I gained, in losing ordinary life and coming back to it, I gained some perspective on that, because so many people who are upset constantly by the news. Again, I'm not saying there aren't plenty of things to be upset about, but so many of them end up living inside the news, right? You live inside your phone, you live inside Twitter, I do that. I still do that a lot. It's a big problem. It's a problem with my profession. But I think sickness and recovery help see that the good things in ordinary life are there to be appreciated, even when the world seems like it's going to hell, and politically or religiously or any other way.
Mm-hmm. So gratitude, basically, right?
Gratitude, yeah. Again, not in any complete way. Tomorrow I will feel extremely ungrateful.
Sure.
I'm sure. But yes, having ordinary, like a serious chronic illness in a way that's really hard to explain before you've had it, it strips basic pleasure out of life. And so getting basic pleasure back teaches you something that you didn't know before.
Anything you take a special pleasure in? Just ordinary life? I'm just curious.
Well, I have a lot of kids, right? So there's a way in which, one of my biggest psychological fears while this was going on was this sense of like, I will, we just had our third child, my first son, right? And so I'm, holding a baby, racked by pain, like driving my wife insane with my own problem. She's suffering along with me. And just this sense then that like, I was going to fail as a father, right, in some way, was very, very powerful. And so in that sense, like some of the ordinary things that I appreciate the most are, you know, packing the kids into the minivan for an afternoon of them complaining, right, bitterly as you drive them to a picnic spot or something, right? Like, I mean, we've done a bunch of trips with our, like, we have a large family. We've done a bunch of crazy trips across the country to Europe. We drove all over California and so on. And I'll know people who, have fewer kids and will say, I can't imagine, going around with all of your kids like this and so on. And to me, I'm like, no, this is great. It's fantastic. Yeah, that it has all these stresses, but they're ordinary stresses. It's like the stress of, the baby needs a diaper change and the kids are hungry and, your Airbnb is not what you'd hoped it would be. And like those are all real and potent, but they're so ordinary, right? And I think the ability to see them as ordinary then makes it possible to do crazy trips and do, have certain kinds of fun that, maybe I would not have been able to do in the same way before I had been ruthlessly taught to appreciate the ordinary.
Well, Ross, I'll speak more personally. I think we had lunch as you were just coming out of the Lyme disease. And I will say, I'm glad that you're grateful. I'm glad that you learned these things. I'm also glad that you're feeling better.
Yeah. And that is really, it is really important, right? Like the hope, it is part of the reason that when I, talk to people who have chronic illness and I try, someone emails me who's sick. I'm really bad at getting back to email, but I do try to email people back who are having experiences similar to mine. But with chronic illness, right? Terminal illness is a different kind of thing, right? But with chronic illness, it really is important to figure out a way to seek health, right? Like I don't think that when God gives us these kind of trials that we're just called to endure them. Like we are reasoning capable people. We have hopefully friends and family who can help us. And it's not going to be true in every case, but for most people in those kind of situations, there's going to be a path to some kind of improvement, and seeking it and having hope in that is as important as having cosmic hope as well.
Yeah. And I also think that, when we are ill, we are more vulnerable. And we're sometimes more open to letting God in. I sometimes, say to people, it's not as if God gave Ross this illness and ordered that, right? It's not kind of this transactional thing, but that you're more vulnerable, you're open to things, you're open to learning, open to insights. And I think that's a lot of people's experience in illness. I really want to talk about your latest book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, obviously, as the title suggests.
Everyone.
Well, I agree.
This is a good podcast for that message. Yeah.
I agree. The book is very pro-belief. I want to just jump right in. How do you reach out to agnostics and atheists? I mean, I know you do it in the book in different ways, but what do you find most effective? I'm sure you deal with people in, as a New York Times columnist, you're working in the secular world, as it were. What's the best approach that you've found?
Something that I found both in writing this book and in talking about it afterward is that there's just tremendous variation in the place where people are likely to be most open to an argument for believing in God and becoming Christian ultimately, since, this is a general book, but I am a Christian, right? And so part of the argument in the book, right, is that I'm not trying to present a single philosophical proof that will settle the existence of God question for all time. I don't have the philosophical equipment to do that. And I don't think, I'm not saying, okay, Thomas Aquinas' third way is it. That's it. It settles the debate.
That's right.
No.
Here it is.
The argument, and yet it is, right? Yeah, the argument in the book is that there are sort of converging lines of evidence and reasons to believe in God. And some of these have to do with what we know from science about the structure of the universe, the sort of fine-tuning of physical laws to make human life possible in the first place. Some of them have to do with the mystery of our own consciousness and how it relates to the world and its unusual capacities for understanding that higher order. And some of them have to do with some of the stuff we were talking earlier, the persistence of religious experience, the fact that mystical experiences happen even to convince atheists, all of which suggests not just that there's a kind of order to the universe, but that whatever is responsible for the order is also interested in us, right? And what I find is that like often one of those lines of argument will be kind of a way in to people who are very resistant to a different line of argument. So I will talk to some people for whom, you know, the evidence for fine-tuning in the laws of the universe is really potent, and they'll be really struck by that, and they'll say, yeah, this is a really compelling argument. I don't think atheism has an answer for it, right? But then if you pivot to the supernatural, they're like, oh, come on, man.
Right.
I can't buy that stuff. And then you have people for whom it's quite the reverse. I did a podcast with Andrew Sullivan, right? A fellow Catholic with a complicated relationship to the church, right? And so Andrew is a believer, but Andrew just, he would have nothing to do with the, fine-tuning laws of physics argument. He's like, no, come on, the universe is too big. We can't, Earth is too small. You can't say that God intended it. But he's all in for the personal, the direct encounter with God, this sort of personal experience as the primary form of evidence. So I think you have a lot of variation in sort of where people are open, people who are not, Andrew is a believer, but people who are not yet believers. And I think what you're trying to do if you're arguing or having a friendly conversation or anything is trying to basically take that point and sort of broaden it a bit. Say, okay, so this is interesting, and it's interesting that you find this compelling, and what if we bring in this piece as well, and this, this piece here, you're trying to sort of add to the reasons that they, in most cases, already have to some degree, right? And then to convince people that this is all in the end quite reasonable, right? Like that, I think there are a lot of secular people who are interested in religion, open to religion, but just take for granted that to become religious is to leave reason behind in some way. Like, wouldn't it be nice if it were true?
Right.
Maybe it is even true, but we're certainly never going to reason our way there. And, I agree, you're not going to reason your way into a relationship with God any more than you could reason your way, into a love affair, right? But can you use reason to say there probably is a God and it might be good to have a relationship with him? In the same way you might use reason to say, it might be good to get on the dating market and see what happens, right? I think there the answer is very clearly yes. I think having religious interest is extremely reasonable. And yeah, I'm trying to persuade more people that is the case.
I think that's very helpful. I mean, the idea that you're meeting people where they are. St. Ignatius says, go in their door.
True. Yes. In the Ignatian spirit. That's right. Going to the margins.
Well, but I mean, there's
New York Times readers. That's right.
There's right. The extreme margins. No, Ignatius says, go in their door and come out your door, so go in where they're comfortable. Let me ask you one more question on this topic. This is one of my favorite topics, the inability or the unwillingness of people to really believe in the supernatural, or, relatedly, we were talking about mystical experiences. I mean, so much of the Gospels is Jesus performing miracles. The resurrection is obviously the supernatural event par excellence. When I was in theology, I took a New Testament course with Dan Harrington, the New Testament professor, and we were talking about the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, and I'm sure you've heard the famous interpretation that was all about sharing.
Yes,
people brought out
the miracle,
the miracle of sharing.
Yeah,
and Dan Harrington called this, which I love this. That's the nice thought interpretation. Like, oh, isn't that a nice thought that people are sharing? Whereas, it's in all four Gospels. It's in two of the Gospels twice. So Jesus did miracles. What have you found helpful to move people to that? I mean, in terms of Jesus, they'll say, he's a sage. I understand, forgiveness, but walking on water, raising Lazarus from the dead. What do you find helpful, if anything?
I think in the case of Jesus himself, the strongest arguments just rest in a weird way on the biggest miracle, right? That actually, I feel like more people have been convinced by the resurrection narratives than by, any of the sort of more quote unquote ordinary miracles.
Mm-hmm.
The resurrection is so much at the center of the Gospels. It's such an extreme claim, but it's also the place with the strongest attestation in a weird way. Like it's happening, in this sort of broad political daylight. It has these immediate world-altering effects in sort of the foundation of the Christian church and so on. And so, again, not everyone is going to be convinced, but like if you're talking about the New Testament itself, I think it is often a kind of like, everything rests on how you react to the sheer strangeness of the passion and the resurrection narrative.
Totally agree.
In ordinary life, I think it really ends up being about both what you yourself have experienced and other people that you know, right? Like, I think in a world where there is this kind of official knowledge that is totally disenchanted, right? It's just hard for people without some kind of personal thing happening to get fully outside that frame. Lots of people are convinced that the supernatural exists because they have a supernatural experience. And then some people are convinced that the supernatural exists because people they trust and know well tell them stories about crazy shit, if you'll pardon my language, that's happened to them that becomes, that they then have to fold into their understanding of reality. The one thing I'll say in defense of the materialists is that, when it comes to the supernatural, I think God gives way more than atheists and materialists believe. I think, again, you can't be a Catholic without encountering lots and lots of weird stuff that is sort of part of the warp and woof of reality. But he does always, he hides his cards to some degree, right? Like it's not like the atheist can walk out tomorrow and see a levitating saint. Now, they can go read Carlos Ayer's book about levitating saints in the 16th century, and maybe they'll be challenged by that, right? But like, you could imagine a world where there was a little bit more of the supernatural.
Yeah,
and more people would be convinced, right? So there is a way in which, whatever God is doing with the supernatural, it's understandable that not everyone is convinced. I think you have to, you have to be aware of that. Like how much people are convinced depends in part on how much God wants to show them.
I agree with you. I do think everything hinges on that. And I think that you're right about it being kind of the greatest, in a sense, proof. I always say to people, look, you had the disciples who were cowering behind closed doors on Good Friday and Holy Saturday, and then you had them ready to give their lives, and in some cases giving their lives, and something must have happened, right? I mean, you have to kind of grapple with that. And I think just a kind of credible explanation is the resurrection, something dramatic, something real, something physical. So I agree with you. Let me we're going to wrap up. This podcast is centered on how people find God in their daily lives and in their prayer. What would your daily spiritual practices be, Ross?
Very bad, Father.
Well, everybody says that, by the way.
I know everybody says that, but I really mean it. I'm the exception where it's it's sincere. No, I mean this is also something I'll say that I appreciate about Catholicism, right? Catholicism, even in sort of non-trad forms, imposes a bunch of basic obligations, right? You have to go to Mass on Sunday. There are holy days of obligation. You should go to confession a couple times a year, or even, obviously you should go to confession more often, but there's sort of minimums you're supposed to hit. And I really do rely on those things to keep me attached to spiritual practice. I have always, when I, without breaking the seal of the confessional from my own end, right? Like, the things I do, if my reliable confessions is, I've failed to have a disciplined prayer life of any kind, Father, and I think, I do most of my weeks praying at Sunday Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And I also find that like Lent and Advent are tremendously helpful. A sort of a liturgical calendar that, doesn't try and maintain the same pitch all the time, that sort of accepts that like in the summer months, maybe you're going to be thinking about God a little bit less than, in other times of the year, but then says, okay, but here are these moments for intensification, right? Where, you're going to be in church a bit more often. You're, if you haven't gone to confession, you're going to be reminded that you should go to confession, and they're going to be organized around, the most powerful stories in the New Testament, right? Around the birth of Jesus, around the death and resurrection of Jesus. I really rely on those aspects of Catholicism to prevent my faith from becoming a kind of abstract and intellectual thing, which I think is always the temptation for people who write about religion and politics, write in public about the Catholic Church. There's always a temptation to regard that in a weird way as like how you're being Catholic. It's like, well, of course I'm Catholic. I write about Catholicism for the New York Times, right? And that is obviously, not only is that insufficient, that's, often actively counterproductive. But yes, in my mediocrity and failure to maintain sort of certain disciplines, I rely heavily on the church's calendar and the things that it concretely expects me to do.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Ross, we take a question from the audience, and here's our question. It's from someone named Luis. And the question is, how do I advance with my spiritual life when my church life feels so stagnant? Are they two halves of the same coin?
See, that's a really good question, but it seems, slightly above my pay grade. I think that you absolutely don't want to feel like there's some kind of separation between your spiritual life and your church life. Doesn't mean that they, are going to perfectly overlap. But if your church life is not delivering some kind of spiritual nourishment, then you need to shake things up a little bit. And maybe that's as simple as, attending a different mass of the masses that your church, if you're Catholic, right? Let's assume you're Catholic and you're not, church shopping widely, right? But maybe it's a sign that, that you need a new devotional life, that you should be, reading a different set of books, or, there's a lot of diversity within Catholicism, another thing that I appreciate, right? And, maybe the form of Catholicism that you're experiencing is not what God actually wants you to experience. I would also say one other thing: the saints are a very helpful aspect of Catholic life, right? The idea that there are essentially people you can talk to who have, experienced what it is to be a human being, right? Jesus experienced what it is to be a human being, obviously, but the saints do feel a little bit closer in some way. And one thing I definitely do when I'm, sort of hanging around different churches is, you find altars with saint statues, and, you talk to them, you ask them for help. And sometimes you don't get some because they're busy with other requests, from people with tighter relationship to them. And sometimes you do get help. And so that's just sort of all-purpose Catholic advice, I think, when you feel like church as church is not delivering what it should. It's okay to just sort of ask for help with that.
Well, Ross, thank you for answering Luis's question, and thank you for answering all of our questions. It's been a delight to have you on our show. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Father. It's been a pleasure.
I was so glad that he came on our show. I really was.
Yeah, I was too. And I was really appreciative of the conversation that you had with him about his suffering with Lyme disease and really just suffering in general. It's such an evocative topic for so many people, myself included. And it left me, Jim, with this question, really, which is, does God want our suffering, or does God need for us to go through experiences of suffering like the one he described? And how do we reconcile that with the image of Jesus that we find in scriptures of Jesus saying, I come that you might have life and have it to the full?
Exactly. Well, I could have talked with him about that for another hour or two, because it is the question of the mystery of suffering, right? Why is there suffering? Why do we suffer? Why do others suffer? And, I think the most honest answer for that is we don't know, right? This side of the grave, we really don't know. But I think there's certain perspectives, and one of the perspectives that he was talking about was that when we suffer, this is not a reason for suffering, but when we suffer, sometimes we are more vulnerable, right? And God can break in a certain way. So again, as I said in the podcast, it's not as if God causes Ross Douthat to suffer in order that he might learn things. It's that suffering is part of everyone's life. Was part of Jesus's life, obviously. And in those moments, sometimes we are open to that. I think, some of the things I think that are the most helpful with people who suffer are first, recognizing that Jesus suffered, right? That Jesus suffered, not just on the cross, but that Jesus suffered in his day-to-day life. He got sick. He had friends who died. We can presume Joseph died, during his young adulthood. So Jesus suffers, and therefore we're with a God who understands our suffering. I think that's really important. That Jesus is accompanying us in our suffering. We pray to Jesus. We know that Jesus is hearing us in our prayers. And that also there is no cross without a resurrection, right? That ultimately, right, God wants to bring us life. But, it's a great question, Maggie. And I think really the answer, it's a mystery. To sort of give I know you're not asking for this, but to give a quick answer, I think would really sort of denude the question of its importance. And I think that's what Ross's book is really trying to get at, and that's what's one of the points of his book, what he got from that experience, right? So I know you've dealt with this in your own life with other people, but a lot of times it's not what we can sort of impose on people as answers for suffering, but it's encouraging people to find meaning in their suffering. And this, I will say, this was Ross's meaning, that he gleaned from his suffring. So that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I definitely did not intend to
throw
the big theological question at you. But I do feel like we're all asking it in different ways at different points in our life and finding new answers and different meaning depending on the individual and their circumstances. So I was just curious to hear what you gleaned from Ross's own encounter with suffering.
Yeah, and also at the end, when he talked about, again, this is not the reason, God does not, give Lyme disease to this person for this reason, but, at the end, I found very touching, he's more grateful for the ordinary things in his life, right? I mean, driving his kids to a vacation. And so this was the meaning that he was able to gather from that. It's funny, I took a pastoral counseling class. I took a couple when I was, studying theology. And, one of the things they told us was that, we could go in and give people in a hospital or who are dying or who are suffering, an answer or our answers, right? But it's just as important to help people find their own meaning, in the suffering, because it's more personal and it's their meaning. And it's also, you don't want to get in between, God's grace and them, because what they glean and what they learn and what they understand from their suffering and about their suffering, I think really is more important than an answer you can give them, right? To kind of impose on them. So I was really grateful to hear his perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will, each week I write an article to accompany the podcast that'll be on America Media, and I'll talk more about this in that article. So I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers. Thanks to Maggie, of course. Thank you to Luis for his wonderful question. And thank you so much, and God bless you.